Hi, my name is Salome Asega. I'm a new media artist, and I'm also the director of New Ink, a cultural incubator at the New Museum.
Hi, I'm Legacy Russell. I'm the executive director and chief curator at the Kitchen.
Legacy.
I love being here with you.
I love being here with you. I am so happy to be here because selfishly, I know I'm going to learn a lot today because I always learn so much from you.
Yes, but I will say, selfishly, I was excited about having you here because I want to learn from you. So, I'm cheesing out a little bit because I do think that part of the discussion around this exhibition, which brings together 12 artists from different disciplines and perspectives and kind of genres of practice, is really a reflection on what technology looks like, what it can do, right? And so the language of data is something that I know we both share through your creative practice and also as well through your broader pedagogy and methodology as you think and write in the world. And this space with all of this vision inside of it, each of these artists really brings to the fore these questions about, feminist data, queer data, Black data, Latinx data, and having, of course, these different sight lines towards those histories and as well sort of redefinitions is part of what the exercise is of the New Bend.
Mm-hmm. Can you tell us a little bit about how the show came to be?
Yeah, so I think that a lot of what this space is, I would say is like a kind of first step of what I hope will be continued steps. The ways in which this history of Gstaad, which has been a history that I learned about as a kid inside of my home space. And this is also, I think, significant because, it speaks to the kind of often break that occurs between your home space, what you were taught and schooled there, and the ways in which when you go into different types of institutional academy space, right, what looks like a canon, what is the kind of direction you receive is tied to what canonized art history should look like. And so Gstaad was taught to me in my home space as being a central canon, right? And also a kind of feminist history and a history that is a history of reparations in many ways, right? Where, in a kind of collective cooperation, these are Black women who work together over decades and generations of time with really important impact and influence in sort of progressing social and cultural and political questions, right? But then, asking about the ways that, as we enter into institutional space and, for both of us in many ways as students of art history, right? Where the language of modernism and abstraction was just something that ran alongside of this history, but oftentimes did not intersect. And so, for me in this moment now, what brings us to this present period is thinking about really that, show, the original show now 2 decades ago that Rena Lamkins-Fielder organized, and asking questions about, what has occurred between that point to present, right? And really what has occurred is that there's been this incredible cross-pollination of Gstaad, talking about this history as not being site-specific, but certainly one that has an impact and intersection that goes in all different directions. And so some of those directions are really what we're sitting inside of right now.
Yeah. I want to go back a little bit to something you said at the beginning about learning about the history of Gstaad in your home. And I'm curious what kind of intimate and personal and familial relationships you have to textiles and quilts.
Well, I think I grew up in a mixed household and a Black household. And what was interesting was having this presence of grandmothers and aunties, right, who engaged with quilts as just the domestic material, the thing that you have at home that brings you comfort, you inherit from your family members, right, that's passed along. But also, I remember very much so my grandmother, Ivalani, she was somebody who always repurposed textile-based materials into other things. So, like what was a blanket would then become a nightgown, and there were things that, would then travel from things that would be worn into then things that would exist, as a kind of bedspread. And so with that, I think there's this kind of amazing confluence, and this is what I mean when I say technology, right? It's this like complex and dynamic innovation, right, that comes through, what it means to reinvent and engage with material. And so, for that that, there is this intimacy that exists inside of the storytelling of each of these artists and you know, the works that are here, because I think for every single one, there is both this personal connection and also this deep sort of theoretical connection to the sort of dialogue around what textile means to them. And also, you know, to think of the terminology of textile as being something that's really refracted. It actually is not singular in its definition. And so, you know, I guess I'll put to you, right, to think about the history of computing and where that intersects with, you know, this language of the algorithm and how, of course, textile can be a part of that. I know that, you know, in your work, that certainly is something that you have kind of continued to break open, this question of what algorithmic practice should look like and how that can be enacted.
Right.
So, you know, I don't mean to put you on the spot, but, you know.
No. You know, in thinking about this show in particular, I was stuck between quilt making and textile practice, sitting both between an archival practice and also like a practice of futuring and thinking forward, right? Like there's something really special about how all of the works in this room are acting as data trusts, right? They are like collective records of people and histories and stories, but also at the same time are like propelling us forward into like, they're multiverses, and you know what I mean? Like
Exactly.
they are interfaces.
Yeah. And so I think for that, like, there's something machinic about it. And this is why the work of Audrey Bennett in terms of her theorizing on heritage algorithms, and then of course the kind of work that intersects with that of Ron Aglash has been really interesting, I think, is like we kind of crack open what different types of contributions have been that come through the lens of diasporic histories. And, you know, within that, I think there's something that's really amazing about both like the data and metadata of each of these works, that, you know, that there are different kind of tiers of legibility that can stand inside of these practices, and also the ways in which these pieces are intended to be read and who they're for. And I think each of the artists take a really amazing position on that. You know, there is something I think that's really incredible about this notion of kind of a universal artwork being like sort of fractured, right, and broken open, that actually the ways in which these works are intended to be received will have these kind of different frequencies, and there's a different type of listening that is required in you know, kind of considering what it means to, you know, both view the works and also really to kind of to hear them.
In your conversations with the artists, do they think of these works as holding the many?
Well, I think that's what's really amazing, is that there are artists who are in this exhibition who came, you know, quite recently to the history of G's Bend, and so, you know, but you know, who are deeply studied inside of art history, right? So again, speaking to the arc of time of my early learning and being a kid, right? And even now, thinking of people who have like left the academy system quite recently, and still these things are not being taught, right, inside of the same classrooms that are engaging questions of, you know, what abstraction or modernist history should look like. And then also, you know, thinking about this question of being technologists, right, that actually within the sort of tradition of technology and STEM research and practice, right, and pedagogy, that often there is a certain view of what that should look like or who belongs there. And so what is really, I think, remarkable is this idea of, you know, what does it mean to kind of, you know, as a sort of feminist tradition, take that back, right, and ask how can that be decolonized, as a queer tradition, right, as a diasporic tradition. And so many of these artists, I think, are really excited about kind of asking those questions and engaging in different models of discovery, but also really like blurring those lines, and thinking about, you know, really what the language of kind of mastery as it exists within art history, right, can do when it can kind of be turned inside out and on its ear.
I'm curious what you think about what has changed in the 20 years since the Whitney show, because I'm thinking about just kind of the sector and field of technology, and although yes, the technology itself has changed rapidly, right, the challenges remain the same. What has changed in your opinion?
In a weird way, it's everything and nothing, right? Like I think that also is why, Salome, I was so excited to speak with you today, because I think, you know, you have brought through your ongoing work and research so many of those questions kind of in concentric circles, and like you ask us kind of to keep walking them as we consider, you know, where are we going? What are the directions that, you know, we can kind of take from, you know, that point to present, and then as we move into the future, you know. I think the relationship, of course, between Blackness and technology and questions of transmission that engage both the digital, right, and then also as well, what exists through and beyond our screens is something that is really essential as a kind of next step and stage of this conversation. And also really like to think through allowing for practices to be sort of continuously and insistently and necessarily blurred, so that artists who are producing work, right, that they can kind of, build on and extend and really like push through each of these practices and have them be less fiercely protected, right, and as well like less segregated, I would say, right, thinking about the kind of necessary permeability between disciplines and also really between histories.
Yeah, so just thinking about like quilting in my own family and what you've said, has happened in your family about aunties around a table and grandmas around a table working together to build these pieces. I'm curious about how some of these artists might have collaborated with non-people, non-humans, machines, right? Like I know some of these artists are using digital printing or digital fabrication techniques, right? And so what can you say a little more about the process of collaborating with people or non?
Yeah. I think that like the question is an exciting one because it helps us maybe understand differently what it means to do work collectively or to have these types of works produced and have a social element to them. I think also it speaks to the fact that, Black work, queer work, feminist work has inherently always been work that pushes the boundaries of what it means to both be collective and as well to engage with questions of the machine, right? That actually the boundary between the two has been so slim and at points even non-existent altogether, right? That actually that these things are deeply bound up inside of one another. And so, what I think is really awesome is that this presence of the machine makes that known and allows as well for there to be this kind of really complex elasticity that snaps back, but also as well like continues to be really sticky and complicated and asks really important political questions, right? In addition to ones that engage this idea of the material, right? As tied to, really what is the definition of a machine, right? And as well, like what are the ways in which our kind of artistic mediums become both proxy to machinic practice and or replicate them, and kind of how those things can be achieved. So there are works inside of this exhibition, and as well what I've always admired too about the history and traditions of Gstaad, which is a living history, right? These works continue to be produced, and also the works that exist in the world continue to be passed on and inherited. That within that, there's actually so much information that has been stored and processed, right, and unpacked and read, and that within that too are these different models of what machinic should look like, right, and how, of course, that can be achieved.
Have you talked to any of the women from Gstaad about this show, and it's particularly about this technology and computing piece?
Well, so what's really neat is that when I kind of began thinking about how this show could occur right now, it was talking to Raina Lampkins-Fielder about the original exhibition and kind of thinking through the ways that these different threads can be brought together. And in this pandemic moment, asking about how the different generations can literally share space. And so, it was Raina who certainly said that, the hope would be that folks could be, in person and somehow convene. And so, we're looking forward to figuring out a way to make that possible, if not in this current moment, then in the moments as they come. But part of the hope is that this exhibition can be a love letter to Gstaad, and that I think a lot of the artists who are in this exhibition and those as well who have followed their work, right, are so excited about the possibility of this conversation because these are idols, right? These are people who folks have continued to learn from and to kind of engage with in terms of the practices, the processes, the questions of design, right? And art history and how all those things are sharing space. And I think that is what the maybe next step would be, right? Thinking about how that can be actualized and as well like made physical.
I want to brainstorm with you. This is going to be a very messy question.
I love it.
But I'm thinking just about as we move into Web3 and Metaverse.
Oh my gosh, the Metaverse.
And move towards a more embodied internet. How you're reading this kind of transition moment, considering we're sitting in a room where people have always embodied technology. And again, like this goes back to the tech might be new, but the challenges and stories are old, right? Yeah. And so, how are you, I guess, it's going to be a messy question. I'm thinking about these quilts as, again, interfaces, right? Mm-hmm. And how they are cooperatively owned. They are owned by people living and non-living, mm-hmm. and they don't exist on a platform. What are the lessons that can be learned here as we move into a more embodied digital experience?
I feel like I'm gonna have a messy question that I love, and I like also a messy answer that probably after we even finish talking, I'll probably have 8,000 more things to say about it. But I feel like the metaverse has always existed. And mm-hmm. this is why it's a complicated thing to have this be something that's kind of posited as being novel, right? Because we have stood inside of what that is as a technological experience for generations. This idea of what, kind of blurs different types of machinic engagement, mm-hmm. and as well, the necessary requirement really as a kind of act of refusal, but also a kind of proposal towards a different type of life, right? And a sustainability is really thinking through what technologies can be made possible to help us get there, right? To kind of envision like what those points beyond are and have those things be actualized collectively. So, I think it's amazing to consider within these different practices here, sitting inside of this room, very much so, right? That a lot of these artists are returning to, the hand, even if they're mm-hmm. engaging with the relationship between the hand and the machine, right? Mm-hmm. The hand is like a very present specter within all of it, mm-hmm. right? And so the question of physicality then becomes something that is really interesting because it's impossible to engage with these works and have them be things that purely exist on sort of one end of the binary or the other, right? They like, automatically create a bridge between the two. Mm-hmm. And so, with this space, right, it is as much as important as being inside of it, right? And being able to kind of process that data, right? But also as well, being able to experience it, at different registers and as well kind of within and through different positions. So for, as much as one might experience being inside of this site, the great hope would be too that there's a kind of journeying beyond it and allowing for those experiences to be, kind of mutually informed and engaging in these histories, as is the experience of standing right in front of the work. Mm-hmm. So that kind of blurriness is something that can be difficult to articulate, but I feel like we're getting closer and closer to better understanding, especially in this moment where so much has had to occur by default as remote, right? To allow then for those spaces to kind of exist with many holes, right? And that in those holes, right, are kind of amazing possibilities of creating new things and thinking about as well the language around it.
Right. Yeah, the binary is blurry for sure. And this is what we learn from glitch feminism and also from Amiri Baraka, right? And technology mythos. This is, we know the binary, does not exist, right? But if it does, is it in fact blurry?
Yes, you mentioned, I think as we were preparing for this talk, Romy Morrison. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to maybe come back to that because certainly I think there's so much inside of that practice that, is instructive when we think about the ways in which, of course, art history is being produced, right? And as well, questions are being asked by individuals who, like yourself, right, stand at an intersection, right, that is both institutional and creative, and in shaping what that can even look like, right? That actually it's incredibly important to have artists doing that work, driving that work, and living in it, right? Reacting and engaging with that line of questioning from their own lived experience and creative practices. So I'm wondering, maybe to put a question to you, what through that line of thought, what that looks like, right? Or, what are the ways in which you have found that artists are instructive to each other in kind of exchanging different types of pedagogy, but also really like doing some of the necessary work that sometimes does not occur inside of an institutional site.
Right. Well, Romy Morrison's work is so interesting because they are thinking about the ways quilts and textiles transmit and receive data. Mm-hmm. And so they actually build into their textile work an audio quality. Mm. So they're having conversations with Black women about how they grew up, what they see for their futures. And then that story is archived in the quilts. And so you can actually sit in front of the quilts and hear a story, which I think is just so beautiful. And then in terms of this question around where do we learn from each other, I feel like is at the heart of the question.
Yeah, yeah. And also like how can artists do some of that instructing? Because I think we're in a really unique and quite frankly challenging, oftentimes problematic moment, right? Where there is so much of an ask, right? A somatic ask, an intellectual ask for different types of labor, right? And the ways in which, of course, that artists are being asked to kind of step into the room, right? And you know, what that looks like, I think at points can be, you know, come in lots of different forms, but it feels really necessary, right? Because it's this idea of, you know, what it means to be represented,
right.
And seen and heard, and have as well institutional spaces do that important work. So, you know, I'm kind of asking, I guess, about like, you know, in that vision, how that can maybe manifest as we think about really what it means to have artists work together. In this case, I'm thinking very much so about the possibility of this exhibition. This group of artists really work together to you know, shape this vision and to have this come into being.
Yeah. You know, I feel like now entering what is the third year of the pandemic, we're really feeling like a sense of artist for artist. And I know from working at New Ink, our artist community is disinterested in kind of a status quo or traditional engagement with a creative economy or a labor economy. They want more, and they want something new, and they want something different. And so with kind of interdependence as their North Star, they're building their own structures outside of institutions to learn from each other and to build with each other. To bring it back to Web3 a little bit, you know, they're building DAOs, right? They're building data trusts. And they're thinking about artist ownership. And I just feel like these are the kinds of things that I want to invest my time in and the resources I have access to into these kinds of experiments, because we all are craving something different.
I agree, yeah. And I will say, like, to kind of come back to the question of the archive as kind of maybe posed in your speaking about Romy's work, like the ways in which archival work, right, artists doing that work of both the sort of engagement of data, right, the storage of data, but then also like making determinations and recommendations about, you know, really what does it mean to have those traces set into the future. These are things I think that are so important. And, you know, coming from, in my, you know, of course, own work as a curator, places like the Studio Museum in Harlem and now being at the Kitchen, these are artist-driven visions. So, you know, thinking through really the possibility of really what it means to kind of set forward kind of different institutional machines, right? That artists actually really are providing those pathways and kind of showing us what that should look like. And I think we're, you know, kind of in the middle of it and just at the beginning of it in so many ways, given how quickly things keep changing. But, you know, it continues to be this amazing opportunity to consider really, like, from that 20 years ago to present, the instructions of Gstaad, right? That letter to the future that Raina wrote, and that now we're kind of standing in and manifesting further.
I'm curious about some of the placements of these works, and again, thinking about how quilts can then encode information, right? Can encode data. What is maybe being transmitted and received on the walls here?
Well, I mean, I think that, like, there's as much the presence of the quilt, right, as there is the presence, I would say, of the archive, like when I'm thinking of, you know, with Tamashi Jackson's work, or thinking very much so of the presence of the protest banner through Tuesday's work. And then, you know, as well asking questions about, you know, the practices that are not quite textile or quilting practices, but that engage with the sort of formal challenge of that, right, as a kind of prompt and provocation. So, you know, thinking of, you know, a Sojourner's work as a painter, thinking of Genesis, and, you know, asking as well, you know, how can these different types of disciplines really, like, borrow from one another, or gaze at one another and learn from each other. And then, you know, I'm also, you know, recognizing that there are these kind of more direct applications of what, you know, weaving and textile work work and quilting work can be. And, we see that in the work of Zadie Cha and Diedrich Brackens, right? We see that in the work of Basil Kincaid. So, the different interpretations as, when we kind of consider how these things can be broken open, they point in many different directions, so they diverge and converge. And I think that for that reason, the exhibition is not intended to be conclusive, right? There actually is not a period at the end, right? It's about, the ways in which it can kind of open up our sight lines. And that being something that kind of gives us the possibility of there being something few steps beyond, right? And perhaps 20 years into the future, although I hope that it occurs sooner, there will be other moments of this kind of writing backwards and forwards, and in that exchange and dialogue, thinking of those new bends for sure.
I'm also thinking about artist Pamela Liu, who is a new media artist who built her own digital loom. And
we were talking about that earlier, this the sort of connection between the loom and computing.
And she, thinks of quilts and textiles as graphic images, and each weave is its own pixel, which I think is just so beautiful, because then she builds these. It's easier then to then think about the math, right?
Right.
Of these objects.
Yeah. Well, I think that, to your point, right, about the relationship between the body and machine, the possibility of what a pixel is, right, really is, it's a stitch. And so the ways that can be kind of explored and expanded, I'm thinking deeply about the incredible Jack Whitten show, of course, that occurred here at Hauser Wirth, and inside of just it's a tesserae as a tile, right? It's a pixel as a stitch, right? Thinking about the ways that these kind of micro components of a greater data can tell us a story, and also that they can be so specific that actually it's within this kind of tiny piece there are oceans of history, and so it is patient work, right? It's like durational work to spend time with this history, but also as well, the materials that are in the room, because it is not work that gives a shallow read, right? It's something that requires you to go back and back again and look closer and kind of engage with the tactility of the material. And that is something that, can be really ecstatic, right? Because it's a kind of meditative process. It becomes something that is like a spiritual journeying in addition to an intellectual one.
Are there any special stories you can share about the materials in this room? I'm just thinking about the kinds of quilts I own that have, a second life. They're reused materials.
There are artists who created work specific to this exhibition, with, the kind of prompt of Gstaad in mind, right? Because they, wanted to have a kind of direct connection to what that story is and kind of create work for, right? To pay homage. And then there are other artists whose work existed previous to this show and, that kind of thought together with me about what felt exciting given this framework of this incredible history and how to celebrate it. And so to have those different types of approaches brought together and share space, and also to have artists who, are in conversation with people who are, on opposite sides of the country, the world, right? Different generations. These are things that I think are really amazing, and really my kind of great frustration about this pandemic period is the fact that we can't all be in the same room at the same time, because I know that the artists, that kind of pilgrimage or journeying towards not only these different parts of history, but also as well the possibility of kind of meeting, their sort of foremothers, if you will, is something that folks spoke about very, very openly as we were working towards this as a show. And so, I kind of look forward to the ways where that can be made possible, because right now these are histories that are in an intersection, right? They are living and breathing in the same moment in time. And so, that would be really what the goal would be of this as an exhibition, if it holds any goal at all, is both that celebration and also as well the possibility for the kind of channel of discourse to continue to grow.